I always thought I understood my place in the family. I was Eleanor, the quiet one, the one who tried too hard, the one who somehow never quite belonged despite sharing the same blood. But standing in front of my sister Margaret's house that Saturday evening, watching through the bay window as my entire family celebrated without me, I realized I had been living a lie for 63 years. The warm glow of the dining room chandelier illuminated faces I had loved my entire life. My 3 siblings, their spouses, their children, even my 90-year-old mother seated at the head of the table like a queen holding court. They were all there, laughing, raising glasses in what appeared to be a toast, while I stood in the shadows of the oak tree in the front yard, my heart breaking into pieces I didn't know could still shatter. What made it worse was the banner hanging above the fireplace, celebrating 40 years of Thompson family traditions. 40 years. For decades of gatherings I apparently hadn't been worthy of attending. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had driven here on impulse, drawn by a Facebook photo my nephew had accidentally included me in before quickly deleting it. Thank goodness for notification emails. I had spent the entire day wondering if I should come, if I should finally confront the family that had been systematically excluding me, while maintaining the pretense of love during obligatory holiday visits. Now, seeing them all together, seeing how complete and happy they looked without me, I had my answer. I had never belonged here. I had been fooling myself. But as I watched them through that window, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the sight of my mother, the woman who had given birth to me but had spent decades treating me like an inconvenient reminder of her past mistakes. Maybe it was seeing Margaret, my older sister, who had perfected the art of making me feel small with just a look. Or perhaps it was finally understanding that their cruelty wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and had been going on far longer than I had ever realized. I had been the family scapegoat for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be angry instead of hurt. Standing there in the darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Righteous fury. They wanted to celebrate 40 years of family traditions? Well, I was about to give them a tradition they would never forget. You see, what my family didn't know, what they had never bothered to learn about me despite having 6 decades to try, was that I had spent my entire career as a private investigator. While they dismissed me as the spinster sister who never amounted to anything, I had been quietly building a reputation as someone who uncovered truths that people desperately wanted to keep hidden. I had helped hundreds of families reunite, exposed countless frauds, and had developed an instinct for reading people and situations that had served me well in every area of my life except this one. I had been too close to see what was right in front of me, but now I saw it clearly. This wasn't just about one missed invitation. This was about a lifetime of subtle exclusions, backhanded compliments, and calculated cruelties designed to keep me on the outside looking in. As I stood there in the darkness, I realized that I had evidence of something that would change everything. Evidence that had been sitting in my filing cabinet for 3 months, waiting for me to find the courage to act on it. The Thompson family reunion was about to become something none of them would ever forget. And for the first time in my life, I was going to make sure they remembered exactly who Eleanor Thompson really was. I had always been the middle child in a family where birth order seemed to determine worth. Margaret, the eldest, had claimed the role of the responsible one, the keeper of family traditions, the one everyone looked to for decisions. David, my younger brother, had been the golden boy, the charming one who could do no wrong even when he was doing everything wrong. My youngest sister Sarah had been the baby, perpetually adorable and worthy of protection even now at 58. And then there was me, Eleanor, the one who tried too hard, cared too much, and somehow never quite got the memo about how family was supposed to work. Growing up, I had attributed their treatment of me to typical sibling rivalry. When Margaret would forget to include me in her birthday parties, I told myself she was just being a typical big sister. When David would make jokes at my expense during family dinners, I convinced myself it was normal brother behavior. When Sarah would conveniently leave me out of her wedding planning despite including every other female cousin, I decided she was just overwhelmed. But the patterns had continued long past childhood. In my 20s, when I announced my engagement to Robert, my family's reaction had been lukewarm at best. Margaret had made pointed comments about how I was settling, and how she hoped I knew what I was doing. David had questioned whether Robert was really right for me despite barely knowing him. Sarah had been mysteriously unavailable to help with any wedding planning, citing work obligations that seemed to disappear when Margaret needed help redecorating her living room the same month. When Robert died in a car accident just 6 months after our wedding, their response had been even more telling. Margaret had spent the funeral reception discussing her own marriage problems. David had used my grief as an opportunity to lecture me about life insurance policies. Sarah had avoided me entirely, claiming she didn't know what to say. None of them had called to check on me in the weeks that followed. None of them had offered to help me sort through Robert's belongings or handle the legal complications of his death. I had been 26 years old, widowed, devastated, and completely alone despite having a large, supposedly loving family living within a 50-mile radius. That was when I had made the decision that would define the rest of my life. If I couldn't rely on family to be there for me, I would learn to be there for other people. I enrolled in criminal justice courses, apprenticed with a retired police detective, and eventually started my own private investigation business specializing in missing persons and family reunification cases. The work had been my salvation. Every case I solved, every family I helped reunite, every truth I uncovered had given me purpose and meaning that I had never found within my own family circle. I had helped teenage runaways reconnect with parents who had never stopped searching for them. I had reunited adoptees with birth families who had spent decades wondering what happened to the children they had given up. I had exposed adultery, fraud, and abuse, always on the side of truth and justice. My family, however, had never shown much interest in my work. When I tried to share stories of cases I had solved, they would change the subject. When I won awards from professional organizations, they would offer perfunctory congratulations before moving on to discuss Margaret's latest promotion or David's golf handicap. When clients would thank me for changing their lives, my family would act as though my job was an embarrassing hobby, rather than a successful career. For 40 years, I had convinced myself that they were just uncomfortable with the nature of my work. Private investigation could be messy, complicated, and sometimes involved uncovering things people preferred to keep hidden. I told myself they were simply being protective, wanting to shield themselves from the darker realities of my profession. But now, standing in Margaret's front yard, I realized I had been wrong about their motivations. They weren't uncomfortable with my work because it was messy, they were uncomfortable with it because I was good at it. Because it proved that the family failure, the one they had written off as incompetent and unreliable, was actually skilled, successful, and respected in her field. They preferred me when I was struggling, when I was the one who needed help, when I was the cautionary tale they could point to as evidence of their own superior choices. My success threatened the narrative they had built about our family hierarchy, so they had simply chosen to ignore it. The irony was devastating. I had spent my entire career reuniting families, helping people who felt lost find their way back to the people who loved them. But I had never been able to find my way back to my own family because they had never actually lost me. They had deliberately let me go. As I watched them through the window, I could see my mother at the center of it all, accepting kisses on her cheek from grandchildren and great-grandchildren I barely knew. At 90 years old, she was still sharp, still commanding, still the matriarch who set the tone for how everyone else in the family related to each other. If there had been a family meeting about excluding me from tonight's celebration, it would have been her decision. The woman who had given birth to me had spent my entire life making it clear that I was somehow defective, somehow less worthy of love and attention than her other children. She had never said it directly. My mother was too skilled at emotional manipulation for such crude tactics. Instead, she had used 1,000 small cuts. The phone calls that went to my siblings first, the holiday invitations extended with obvious reluctance, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I had a briefcase in my car containing documents that would explain everything. 3 months ago, a routine estate planning case had led me to information about my own family that had left me questioning everything I thought I knew about my childhood, my identity, and my place in the Thompson family tree. But I hadn't known what to do with that information. Part of me had hoped I was wrong, that there was some innocent explanation for what I had discovered. Another part of me had been afraid that confronting them with the truth would destroy what little relationship I still had with the only family I had ever known. Tonight, watching them celebrate 40 years of traditions I had apparently never been part of, I realized that relationship had never actually existed. I had been holding on to an illusion, desperately trying to earn love from people who had decided long ago that I wasn't worth loving. It was time to stop being Eleanor the outsider, Eleanor the disappointment, Eleanor the one who tried too hard and never quite belonged. Tonight, I was going to be Eleanor the private investigator. The woman who specialized in uncovering hidden truths and reuniting people with realities they had been avoiding. They had no idea what was coming. The first memory that came flooding back as I stood there was from when I was 7 years old. We had been at another family gathering. Ironically, another celebration I almost hadn't been included in, when I had overheard my aunt whispering to my mother about how different I looked from my siblings. "Are you sure she's Tom's?" my aunt had asked, referring to my father. My mother had shushed her quickly, but not before I had caught the meaningful look that passed between them. Even at 7, I had understood that there was something significant about that question, though I hadn't understood what. I had spent the rest of my childhood studying my reflection, comparing my features to those of my siblings, trying to figure out what made me so obviously different that even extended family members noticed. Margaret had inherited my mother's sharp, angular features and dark brown eyes. David had my father's broad shoulders and distinctive cleft chin. Sarah had gotten the best of both parents, my mother's delicate bone structure and my father's warm smile. And then there was me, with lighter brown hair that had natural red highlights, green eyes that no one else in the family possessed, and facial features that seemed to come from some unknown genetic combination. My parents had always deflected questions about the differences in our appearances. "You got your grandfather's eyes," my mother would say when I asked about my green eyes, though I had never seen a photograph of my grandfather and had no way to verify this claim. "You're just unique," my father would add, though there was always something forced about his smile when he said it. As I got older, I had occasionally wondered about my parentage, but I had never seriously pursued the question. The few times I had brought it up, my family's reactions had been so uncomfortable and defensive that I had learned to drop the subject. I told myself it didn't matter, that biology wasn't the same thing as family, that love was more important than DNA. But love, it turned out, was exactly what had been missing. The case that had changed everything had started out routine enough. 3 months ago, a woman named Patricia Henderson had hired me to locate her biological daughter, given up for adoption in 1960. Patricia was dying of cancer and wanted to meet her daughter before it was too late. She had very little information to go on. Just the name of the adoption agency, the approximate date of birth, and a distinctive birthmark she hoped might help with identification. What she did have was money. Patricia Henderson had been married to a successful businessman who had left her extremely well provided for when he died. She was willing to spend whatever it took to find her daughter, and had already been through 2 other investigators who had failed to locate any meaningful leads. I had taken the case because something about Patricia's story had resonated with me. The grief in her voice when she talked about the daughter she had never known, the regret over a decision made under impossible circumstances, the desperate need to make things right before it was too late. It had all felt familiar somehow. It had taken me 6 weeks to track down the relevant records. The adoption agency had closed in 1975, but I had located the social worker who had handled Patricia's case, tracked down the attorney who had facilitated the adoption, and eventually identified the adoptive family, Thomas and Catherine Thompson. My parents. The daughter Patricia Henderson had been searching for was me. I had stared at those documents for hours, reading and rereading the details, trying to make sense of information that turned my entire life upside down. According to the records, Patricia Henderson had been 18 years old when she gave birth to me in 1960. She had been unmarried, abandoned by my biological father, and facing pressure from her own family to give me up for adoption. The Thompsons, who had been married for 3 years and struggling with infertility, had adopted me when I was 6 weeks old. Margaret had been born 18 months later, followed by David and Sarah at 2-year intervals. They had apparently never intended to tell me about the adoption, and the records were sealed in such a way that I should never have been able to access them. But I was a professional investigator with resources and connections that most people didn't have. The information that should have remained hidden forever had been sitting in front of me in black and white. Birth certificates, court documents, hospital records, and most devastatingly, a letter from my birth mother to the adoption agency expressing her hope that someday I might want to know about her. Patricia Henderson hadn't just given me up and forgotten about me. She had thought about me every day for 63 years. She had wondered if I was happy, if I felt loved, if I ever questioned where I came from. She had hoped that the family who adopted me would tell me about her when I was old enough to understand. She had even included updated contact information with the agency every time she moved, just in case I ever came looking for her. She had been waiting for me my entire life. Meanwhile, my adoptive family had spent 6 decades making sure I felt like I didn't quite belong, never knowing that their treatment was actually fulfilling their worst fears, that I might figure out the truth and leave them for my real family. The cruelest part was that it explained everything. Every unexplained slight, every casual exclusion, every time I had felt like an outsider in my own family suddenly made perfect sense. They hadn't been treating me like a family member because in their minds I wasn't one. I was a stranger they had taken in out of obligation, a responsibility they had never fully embraced, a reminder of their own reproductive failures. But instead of owning that reality, instead of either fully embracing me as their daughter or being honest about the adoption, they had chosen a middle path that had left me feeling confused and unwanted for my entire life. They had given me their name and a place at their table, but they had never given me their hearts. The most devastating part was realizing that my birth mother had been alive and searching for me, while my adoptive family had been pushing me away. While I had been desperately trying to earn love from people who seemed determined not to give it, there was another woman out there who had loved me from the moment I was born and had never stopped loving me despite our separation. Patricia Henderson was dying, and I was her only child. She had spent her entire adult life wondering about me, and I had wasted 63 years trying to fit into a family that had never intended to make room for me. The documents were still in my car, along with Patricia's phone number and address. I had been carrying them around for 3 months, trying to decide what to do with the information. Part of me had wanted to call her immediately, to rush to her side and try to make up for lost time. But another part of me had felt guilty about the idea of abandoning the only family I had ever known, even if they had spent my entire life making me feel unwelcome. Now, watching them celebrate 40 years of family traditions without me, I realized I had been worried about abandoning people who had already abandoned me long ago. The reunion banner hanging in Margaret's dining room suddenly took on a different meaning. 40 years of family traditions, which meant they had started these gatherings 2 years after I graduated from high school and moved out on my own. They had literally waited until I was gone to start celebrating as a family. My mother, now 90 years old and presumably getting closer to the end of her own life, had decided to spend her remaining years surrounding herself with the children she had actually given birth to, the ones who carried her genetic legacy. I was just the outsider who had never quite fit in, and now that she was in her final years, she apparently no longer felt obligated to pretend otherwise. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't alone. I had another mother, a mother who had been searching for me, a mother who had never stopped loving me, a mother who was running out of time to tell me all the things she had been saving up to say for 63 years. Standing there in the darkness, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth it. I was done being grateful for scraps of attention from a family that had never fully accepted me. I was done pretending that their treatment of me was normal or acceptable or something I deserved. I pulled out my phone and dialed Patricia Henderson's number. She answered on the second ring, as if she had been waiting by the phone. "Hello. Ms. Henderson," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected. "This is Eleanor Thompson. I believe you've been looking for me." The silence that followed was filled with 63 years of longing, regret, and hope. "Eleanor," she whispered, and I could hear the tears in her voice. "My Eleanor. I knew you would call someday. I never stopped hoping. I just found out about the adoption," I told her, watching through the window as my adoptive family continued their celebration. "I'm so sorry it took this long." "Don't apologize," she said quickly. "You're calling now. That's all that matters. Are you okay? Are you happy? Did they treat you well?" I looked at the family that had raised me, the people who were at this very moment demonstrating just how little I meant to them, and I realized that for the first time in my life I could be completely honest about my experience. "No," I said simply. "They didn't." What happened next was the most healing conversation of my life. Patricia Henderson, my birth mother, my real mother, told me about the day I was born, about how beautiful I had been, about how difficult it had been to let me go. She told me about the father I had never known, a young man who had died in Vietnam before he even knew she was pregnant. She told me about the years of wondering, the private investigator she had hired to try to find me, the hope she had carried that someday we would be reunited. And then she told me something that changed everything. "Eleanor," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I need you to know that giving you up was the biggest mistake of my life. I was young and scared, and I let other people convince me that I couldn't give you the life you deserved. But not a day has gone by that I haven't regretted that decision. You were my daughter then, and you're my daughter now, and if you're willing, I would like the chance to be the mother I should have been all along." Standing there in the darkness outside Margaret's house, listening to the words I had waited 63 years to hear, I finally understood what family was supposed to feel like. It wasn't about blood or obligation or tradition. It was about love, acceptance, and the simple recognition that you mattered to someone. "I would like that too," I told her. We talked for another 20 minutes, making plans to meet, sharing basic information about our lives, trying to compress 6 decades of separation into a single phone conversation. She lived only 2 hours away, had lived within driving distance of me for most of my adult life, hoping that someday fate would bring us back together. When we finally hung up, I felt different. Lighter. Like I had been carrying a weight I didn't even realize was there, and now it was gone. I looked back at the house where my adoptive family was still celebrating, and for the first time I didn't feel hurt by their exclusion. I felt sorry for them. They had spent 40 years building traditions around the absence of someone who had desperately wanted to be included, and now it was too late. They had missed their chance to have a relationship with me, and they had done it so thoroughly that they didn't even realize what they had lost. But I wasn't going to walk away quietly. I wasn't going to let them continue their celebration without understanding exactly what they had done, and what it had cost all of us. I was going to give them a family tradition they would never forget. I walked up the front steps and rang the doorbell. The conversation at the dinner table died instantly when Margaret opened the front door and saw me standing there. Through the doorway, I could see my mother's face drain of color, David's mouth fall open in surprise, and Sarah actually drop her wine glass. "Eleanor," Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled in the way I remembered from childhood when she was trying not to show how angry she was. "What are you doing here?" "I came to join the family celebration," I said calmly. "I hope you don't mind that I wasn't able to RSVP. I never received an invitation." Margaret's eyes darted back toward the dining room, where our entire family was watching this interaction with varying degrees of discomfort and curiosity. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how to handle this situation without causing a scene that would ruin the evening she had obviously spent weeks planning. "Eleanor, this is..." She started, then stopped, apparently realizing that there was no good way to finish that sentence. "A family reunion celebrating 40 years of Thompson family traditions," I finished for her, reading directly from the banner I could see over her shoulder. "How interesting that it's been exactly 40 years. That would be, let me see, 1983 when these traditions started. Just 2 years after I moved out of the house. What a coincidence." The silence stretched uncomfortably as Margaret realized that I wasn't going to make this easy for her. Behind her, I could see David starting to rise from his chair, probably intending to come handle the situation himself. "Perhaps we could step outside to talk," Margaret suggested, moving as if to close the door behind her. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary," I said pleasantly. "After all, we're family, right? And this is a family celebration. I'm sure everyone would love to hear what I have to say." Before she could stop me, I stepped around her and walked into the house I had visited hundreds of times but had never felt welcome in. The smell was exactly the same. Furniture polish and Margaret's lavender candles. But now it felt like walking into enemy territory instead of a family home. "Hello, everyone," I said brightly, looking around the dining room at faces that couldn't quite meet my eyes. "I'm so sorry I'm late. Traffic was terrible coming from Patricia Henderson's house." The name meant nothing to most of them, but I saw my mother's face go completely white. She knew. After all these years, she knew exactly who Patricia Henderson was. "Mom," David said, standing up and moving toward me with the same patronizing smile he had been using on me since we were children. "Why don't you sit down and we'll get you a plate? You must be hungry." "Actually, I'm not hungry," I said, pulling the manila folder from my purse and setting it on the table in front of my mother. "But I am curious about something." I've been going through some old adoption records lately, part of a case I'm working on, and I found some interesting documents. I thought you might like to see them." The folder landed on the table with a soft thud that might as well have been a gunshot for the impact it had on the room. My mother stared at it as if it might explode, while my siblings exchanged glances that confirmed what I had already suspected. They had known about the adoption all along. "Eleanor," my mother said quietly, her voice carrying a warning tone I remembered well from childhood. "Oh, don't worry," I said, opening the folder and pulling out the first document. "These are just copies. I have the originals in a safe place. This one is particularly interesting. It's your application to adopt a child, dated 1960. Look, you can see where you specified that you wanted a girl under 6 months old, and that you preferred the birth mother to be young and healthy." I held up the document so everyone could see it, noting how my siblings were now staring openly at papers that revealed a family secret that had apparently been kept from me alone. "This next one is even more interesting," I continued, pulling out Patricia's letter. "It's from my birth mother to the adoption agency. She was 18 when she gave birth to me, and according to this letter, she specifically requested that the adoptive family be told to contact her if I ever wanted to know about my biological parents." I looked directly at my mother. "Did you know about this letter? Did you know that she wanted you to tell me about her when I was old enough to understand?" My mother's hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady when she answered. "Eleanor, this isn't the time or place for this conversation." "Really?" I asked, looking around the dining room at my siblings and their families, all of whom were watching this confrontation with fascination and horror. "When would be a better time? At next year's family reunion? Oh wait. I probably won't be invited to that one either." "That's not fair," Sarah said, speaking up for the first time. We weren't trying to exclude you. Weren't you?" I asked, turning to face my youngest sister. "Then why didn't I know about these annual gatherings? Why is this the first I'm hearing about 40 years of family traditions? Why have I spent my entire adult life feeling like I didn't quite belong in this family?" The questions hung in the air, and I could see that none of them had good answers. They had been hoping I would never find out about their secret celebrations, never realize how systematically they had excluded me, never understand that my feelings of not belonging had been completely accurate. "And most importantly," I continued, "why did none of you ever tell me that Patricia Henderson, my birth mother, has been looking for me for 63 years? That was when David finally snapped. "Because you're not actually part of this family," he said, his face flushed with anger and whine. "You never were. We tried to include you, we tried to make you feel welcome, but you never fit in. You were always different, always asking too many questions, always making everything about you." The words hung in the air like a physical blow, and I could see from the expressions on everyone else's faces that David had said what they had all been thinking for years. "David," Margaret warned, but the damage was already done. "No, I'm tired of pretending," David continued, standing up and pacing behind his chair. "We all know the truth. We've all been walking on eggshells around Eleanor our entire lives, trying not to hurt her feelings, trying to include someone who was never really one of us to begin with. And now she shows up uninvited to our family gathering and starts making accusations like we owe her something." "We do owe her something," said a voice from the doorway, and everyone turned to see a woman in her early 30s holding a small boy's hand. It was David's daughter Jennifer, with her 5-year-old son Tyler. "Jennifer," David said, his voice warning her not to get involved. "No, Dad," Jennifer said, walking further into the room. "I heard what you said and it's not okay. Eleanor is family. She's been my aunt my entire life. She's the one who taught me to drive when you were too busy. She's the one who helped me with my college applications when everyone else said I wasn't smart enough for university. She's the one who gave me money for my wedding when you said I was too young to get married." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member in turn. "Eleanor has been more family to me than any of you have ever been to her. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're the ones who don't belong here." The silence that followed Jennifer's defense was broken by my mother, who had been staring at the adoption documents throughout the entire confrontation. "I never told her about the letter," my mother said quietly, her voice barely audible. Everyone turned to look at her. "The letter from her birth mother," she continued, picking up Patricia's letter with trembling hands. I received this letter when Eleanor was 18 years old. The birth mother wanted to know if Eleanor would be interested in meeting her. She said she had been thinking about her every day since the adoption and hoped that we had raised her to be happy and confident and loved. My mother looked up at me for the first time since I had arrived. I threw the letter away. I told myself it was because I didn't want to confuse you, didn't want to disrupt your life when you were just starting college. But that wasn't the real reason. What was the real reason? I asked, my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was pounding. I was afraid you would leave us for her, my mother admitted. I was afraid that if you met your birth mother, you would realize that we had never been enough for you, that we had failed you somehow. The admission hung in the air, and I could see that this was the first time my siblings had heard this part of the story. They had known about the adoption, but they hadn't known about Patricia's attempts to contact me. So instead of dealing with that fear, I said slowly, you decided to make sure I never felt like I fully belonged here either. That way if I did leave it wouldn't be such a loss. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. Do you have any idea? I continued, my voice getting stronger. What it's been like to spend 63 years feeling like I was defective somehow? Like there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me unworthy of the same love you gave your other children. Eleanor, Margaret started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished, I said. Do you know that I never married again after Robert died? Do you know why? Because I convinced myself that I was the kind of person who wasn't worth staying for. Because my own family had spent my entire life treating me like I was disposable, so I assumed that's what I was. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each person who had been part of this deception. I spent my career reuniting other families, helping other people find the love and acceptance they had been missing, while my own family was systematically ensuring that I would never find those things here. The irony is almost funny, isn't it? Eleanor, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. We didn't know. We didn't realize. You didn't realize what? I asked. That I was a human being with feelings? That I noticed when I wasn't invited to family gatherings? That it hurt when you excluded me from your children's lives? That I spent holidays sitting alone in my apartment wondering what I had done wrong to deserve such treatment? The room was completely silent except for the sound of Sarah's quiet crying. But here's the thing, I continued, and my voice became calmer, more controlled. It doesn't matter anymore. Because 3 hours ago I had a conversation with Patricia Henderson, my birth mother, and for the first time in my life, I talked to someone who was genuinely excited to hear my voice. I started putting the documents back in the folder. Patricia is dying of cancer. She has maybe 6 months left to live. And she has spent the last 3 months trying to find me because she wanted the chance to tell me that she loves me, and has never stopped loving me since the day I was born. I closed the folder and held it against my chest. So thank you, I said, looking directly at my mother. Thank you for showing me exactly where I stand with this family. Thank you for making it clear that I was never really wanted here. Because now I know where I do belong, and I'm going to spend whatever time Patricia has left making sure she knows that she was worth waiting for. I started walking toward the front door, but David's voice stopped me. Eleanor, wait, he said, and something in his tone was different. What I said earlier. I was angry and I didn't mean. I turned back to face him. Yes, you did mean it. That's the problem. You all meant it, every slight, every exclusion, every time you made me feel like I didn't belong. The only difference is that tonight you were honest about it. What are you going to do? Margaret asked quietly. I'm going to drive to Patricia Henderson's house, I said. I'm going to spend the evening getting to know my mother, my real mother. And tomorrow, I'm going to start making up for 63 years of lost time. I paused at the door and looked back at the family that had raised me but had never embraced me. For 40 years, you've been celebrating family traditions that deliberately excluded me. Well, congratulations. You finally have what you always wanted. A Thompson family reunion with no Eleanor to make things complicated. I opened the front door, then turned back one final time. Oh, and Mom, I said, looking directly at the woman who had given birth to 3 children and adopted one but had never learned to love them equally. Patricia asked me to thank you for taking care of me when she couldn't. She said she always hoped that the family who adopted me would love me as much as she did. I told her I would pass along her gratitude. The drive to Patricia Henderson's house took 2 hours, but it felt like the shortest journey of my life. For the first time in decades, I was driving toward something instead of away from it, moving toward acceptance instead of rejection, toward a future filled with possibility instead of a past filled with disappointment. Patricia lived in a small cottage surrounded by flower gardens that even in the October darkness looked carefully tended and loved. Light spilled from every window, and as I pulled into the driveway, I could see her silhouette in the front window watching for me. She opened the front door before I could knock, and for a moment we just stood there looking at each other, taking in the reality of a reunion 63 years in the making. Patricia Henderson was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair and the same green eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. She was wearing a soft blue sweater and had obviously been crying, but her smile was radiant. "Eleanor," she whispered. And then I was in her arms, being held by my mother for the first time since I was 6 weeks old. We cried together on her front porch, 63 years of separation and longing pouring out in tears that felt like healing. When we finally separated, she cupped my face in her hands and studied my features with the wonder of someone seeing a miracle. "You're so beautiful," she said. "You look exactly like your father did when he was young. I always hoped you would have his eyes." She led me inside to a living room that felt like a warm embrace. The walls were covered with photographs of landscapes and flowers, books filled every available shelf, and soft music played from speakers I couldn't see. It was the kind of home I had always imagined having, but had never been able to create for myself. "I hope you don't mind," Patricia said, gesturing toward the coffee table, which was covered with photo albums, scrapbooks, and what appeared to be a lifetime's worth of carefully preserved mementos. "I pulled out everything I thought you might want to see. Pictures of your father, stories about our time together, things I saved hoping that someday I could share them with you." We spent the next 6 hours going through 63 years of a relationship that had existed only in one person's heart. Patricia showed me photographs of my biological father, a young man named James who had been killed in Vietnam 3 months before I was born. She told me stories about their brief romance, their plans for the future, his excitement when she told him she was pregnant. "He wanted to marry me immediately," she said, showing me a letter he had written from basic training. "He was so happy about the baby. He had already picked out names, Eleanor if it was a girl, James Jr. if it was a boy. You named me after his choice," I realized. "I named you after his choice," she confirmed. "It was the only way I could make sure he was part of your life, even though he couldn't be there to raise you." She showed me the diary she had kept throughout her pregnancy, documenting every doctor's appointment, every change in her body, every hope and fear about the child she was carrying. She had written letters to me that she had never sent, birthday cards she had never been able to give, Christmas presents she had bought and stored in the hope that someday we would be reunited. "I never stopped being your mother," she told me as we looked through a box of gifts she had collected over the years. "Even when I couldn't be with you, even when I didn't know where you were or how you were doing, I never stopped loving you like a mother loves her child." The contrast with my adoptive family was stark and painful. Where they had treated my existence as an obligation, Patricia had treasured every memory she had of me. Where they had made me feel like I was taking up space that belonged to someone else, Patricia had spent 6 decades keeping space for me in her heart and her life. "Tell me about your life," she said when we had finished going through her collections. "Tell me about everything. I want to know who you became, what you accomplished, whether you were happy." So I told her. I told her about my marriage to Robert and how devastated I had been when he died. I told her about my career as a private investigator, and how much satisfaction I had found in helping other families find each other. I told her about the cases I had solved, the awards I had won, the difference I had made in other people's lives. And for the first time in my life, I was talking to someone who was genuinely proud of me. "You became exactly the person I hoped you would become," Patricia said when I finished telling her about my professional accomplishments. "Strong, independent, someone who helps others, someone who stands up for what's right." I couldn't have asked for more. Then I told her about my adoptive family, about the years of feeling like an outsider, about tonight's confrontation and the painful realization of how systematically they had excluded me from their lives. Patricia listened without judgment, her face reflecting my pain as I described decades of subtle rejection and emotional neglect. "I'm so sorry," she said when I finished. "I'm so sorry they didn't love you the way you deserve to be loved. When I gave you up, I thought I was giving you a chance at a better life than I could provide. I never imagined that they would make you feel unwanted." "It's not your fault," I told her. "You made the best decision you could with the information you had. They chose to be cruel. That's on them, not on you." "But if I had kept you," she said, tears streaming down her face, "if I had found a way to raise you myself, you would have grown up knowing every day that you were loved completely and unconditionally. You would never have had to question your worth, or wonder why you didn't fit in." "Maybe," I said. "But then I might not have become who I am." The pain I experienced made me empathetic to other people's pain. The feeling of not belonging made me determined to help other people find where they belong. I might not like the journey I took to get here, but I like who I became along the way. We talked until sunrise, filling in 63 years of separation with stories, questions, and the simple joy of being together. When Patricia finally showed me to the guest room she had always kept ready for me, I felt more at home than I had anywhere in my entire life. "Eleanor," she said as I was getting ready for bed, "I know I can't make up for all the years we lost. I know 6 months isn't enough time to build the relationship we should have had. But I want you to know that finding you, getting this chance to know you, is the greatest gift I could have received." "You didn't find me," I corrected her. "I found you. And I'm the one who received the gift." Over the next few weeks I spent every free moment with Patricia. We had 6 months to make up for 63 years, and we were determined to make the most of every day. She showed me photograph albums from her entire life, told me stories about her family, her career, her travels. I learned that I had inherited not just her eyes and my father's features, but also her love of reading, her talent for organization, and her instinct for helping people solve their problems. "You get that from both sides," she told me one afternoon as we were looking through her scrapbooks. "Your father was the kind of person everyone came to for advice. He had a gift for seeing situations clearly and helping people figure out what to do next." Patricia had never married, had never had other children. She had spent her entire adult life focusing on her career as a librarian and her volunteer work with literacy programs, but she admitted that part of her had always been waiting for me to come back into her life. "I dated," she told me. "I had relationships. But I could never fully commit to building a life with someone when part of my heart belonged to a daughter I might never see again." The guilt I felt about that revelation was almost overwhelming. Because of my adoptive family's deception, Patricia had spent 63 years carrying the pain of our separation, wondering about me, hoping for a reunion that might never come. My adoptive family, meanwhile, had made no effort to contact me after our confrontation at Margaret's house. No phone calls, no letters, no attempts to apologize or explain their behavior. Their silence confirmed what I had already realized. They were relieved to finally be rid of the family member who had never quite fit their expectations. But I wasn't sitting around waiting for their apologies. I was too busy building a relationship with someone who actually wanted me in her life. Patricia and I established routines and traditions that felt natural and comfortable in a way nothing ever had with my adoptive family. Sunday dinners where we cooked together and talked about our weeks. Evening walks around her neighborhood where she pointed out flowers and shared memories of people who had lived in various houses over the years. Quiet mornings reading in her sunroom, comfortable in each other's silence. She introduced me to her friends, her neighbors, her volunteer colleagues, always with obvious pride. "This is my daughter Eleanor, the private investigator I've been telling you about." No one questioned the timing of my appearance in her life or seemed to find it odd that her 63-year-old daughter was just now becoming part of her social circle. They simply welcomed me as an extension of the woman they already loved and respected. For the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be claimed, to be presented to the world as someone worth being proud of, someone whose presence added value rather than created obligation. Patricia's cancer was aggressive, but her spirit remained strong throughout her treatments. On days when she felt well enough, we would take drives through the countryside, visit museums, or simply sit in her garden talking about everything and nothing. On days when the chemotherapy left her weak and nauseous, I would sit beside her bed reading aloud from books she had loved, sharing comfortable silence, or helping her write letters to friends she wanted to stay in touch with. "I feel like I won the lottery," she told me one afternoon when she was having a particularly good day. "Not only did I get to meet my daughter, but I got to discover that she grew up to be someone I genuinely like and admire. Even if we weren't related, I think we would be friends. Even if we weren't related, I think you would be the mother I always wished I had," I replied. 3 months into our reunion, Patricia's condition began to deteriorate more rapidly. The treatments that had initially slowed the cancer's progression were no longer working, and her doctors recommended transitioning to palliative care focused on keeping her comfortable, rather than fighting the disease. "I'm not afraid of dying," she told me when we received the news. "I'm only afraid of leaving you alone again." "I'm not alone," I assured her. "You gave me the greatest gift possible. You showed me what it feels like to be truly loved. That's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, regardless of what happens next." "Promise me something," Patricia said, taking my hand in hers. "Anything. Promise me you won't waste any more time trying to earn love from people who aren't capable of giving it. Promise me you'll spend your remaining years surrounding yourself with people who see your value, who appreciate your strength, who celebrate your existence instead of merely tolerating it." "I promise," I said, and I meant it. "And promise me you'll be open to love again. Romantic love, I mean. You're only 63 years old, Eleanor. You have years ahead of you, and you deserve to spend them with someone who thinks you're remarkable." That promise was harder to make, but looking into her green eyes that looked so much like my own, I found myself nodding. I promised that too. Patricia Henderson died on a Tuesday morning in February, 6 months and 3 weeks after our first phone conversation. I was holding her hand when she passed, and her last words were, "Thank you for coming home to me." The funeral was everything she would have wanted. Simple, dignified, and attended by dozens of people whose lives she had touched through her work and volunteer activities. I gave the eulogy, standing at the podium in the same church where she had attended services for 30 years, talking about a woman who had spent her entire life showing kindness to others, and who had loved her daughter from the moment she was born until the moment she died. Patricia Henderson was many things, I said, looking out at the congregation of friends, neighbors, and colleagues who had gathered to honor her memory. She was a librarian who helped thousands of people find the information they needed. She was a volunteer who taught countless adults to read and write. She was a friend who could be counted on for support, advice, and comfort. I paused, gathering my courage for the next part. But most importantly, she was a mother. For 63 years, she carried the love she felt for a daughter she couldn't raise, never knowing if she would get the chance to express that love directly. When we were finally reunited 6 months ago, she poured decades of stored-up maternal love into every conversation, every shared meal, every quiet moment we spent together. My voice broke slightly, but I continued. She gave me the gift of knowing that I had been loved from the very beginning, that my existence had brought joy to someone's life, that there was a person in this world who thought I was worth waiting for. In 6 months, Patricia Henderson managed to give me more maternal love than I had received in the previous 63 years combined. I looked down at the front row, where Patricia's closest friends were sitting, and saw tears streaming down faces that reflected the loss of someone irreplaceable. Patricia died knowing that her daughter was safe, successful, and surrounded by people who loved her. She died knowing that the child she had worried about for over 6 decades had grown up to be someone she was proud to call her own. In her final months, she got to experience the joy of being not just a mother, but a mother whose child had turned out exactly as she had hoped. After the service, as people were sharing memories and offering condolences, Jennifer, David's daughter, approached me hesitantly. "Aunt Eleanor," she said, her voice uncertain. "I know this probably isn't the best time, but I wanted to tell you that I've been thinking about what happened at Grandma's house, and I wanted to apologize for my family's behavior." I studied my niece's face, seeing genuine remorse and embarrassment about her relatives' treatment of me. "You don't have anything to apologize for, Jennifer," I told her. "You were the only one who stood up for me that night." "I should have stood up for you years ago," she said. "I should have said something every time they excluded you from family events. I should have invited you myself. You were a child for most of those exclusions," I pointed out. "And as an adult, you were dealing with your own relationship with them. I never expected you to fight my battles for me. What they did was wrong, Jennifer said firmly. And I want you to know that Tyler and we don't want to be part of a family that treats people that way. If they can't see your value, then maybe we're the ones who need to step away. The irony wasn't lost on me that my adoptive family's cruelty toward me was now fracturing their relationships with the next generation. Jennifer's defense of me that night had apparently caused ongoing conflict within the family, with some members taking sides and others trying to pretend nothing had happened. I appreciate your loyalty, I told her. But I don't want to be the cause of division in your family. You should maintain whatever relationships work for you. You're not causing division, Jennifer said. Their behavior is causing division. There's a difference. Over the following months, as I settled Patricia's estate and began the process of grieving someone who had become the most important person in my life in just 6 months, I heard occasional updates about my adoptive family through Jennifer and through mutual friends in our small community. Margaret had apparently become defensive and angry when friends and neighbors asked why I hadn't been at the family reunion they had been talking about for weeks beforehand. Her explanations about family complications and difficult dynamics had not been well received by people who had known me for decades and had never seen evidence of me being difficult or complicated. David had reportedly told several people that I had overreacted to not being invited to one family gathering, demonstrating a complete inability to understand that the reunion had been the culmination of decades of exclusion rather than an isolated incident. Sarah had apparently been asking mutual friends for my phone number, wanting to reach out but not knowing how to approach me after our confrontation. My mother, now 91 and increasingly frail, had, according to Jennifer, become obsessed with the adoption documents I had shown them, reading and rereading Patricia's letter and apparently experiencing some form of regret or guilt about her choices. But none of them had contacted me directly. Even in the face of social disapproval from their community and internal family conflict, they had chosen to maintain their position rather than acknowledge their treatment of me or attempt to make amends. Their silence was actually a relief. It confirmed that I had made the right decision in walking away, that these were not people capable of the kind of self-reflection and emotional growth that would be necessary to build genuine family relationships. Instead, I focused on the legacy Patricia had left me. The knowledge that I was worthy of love, the understanding that family is about choice and acceptance rather than obligation and tolerance, and the determination to surround myself with people who celebrated rather than merely endured my existence. I also inherited Patricia's house, along with a financial legacy that was substantially larger than I had expected. She had been frugal throughout her life, investing wisely and living modestly, always with the hope that someday she would have a daughter to provide for. I want you to have security, she had told me when we discussed her will during her final weeks. I want you to have the resources to make choices based on what will make you happy, rather than what you think you can afford. The house felt like a haven in a way no place had ever felt to me before. Surrounded by Patricia's books, her photographs, her carefully tended gardens, I felt connected to a history that was actually mine. A story that included me as a central character rather than a peripheral afterthought. I began redecorating slowly, keeping elements that felt like Patricia, but adding touches that reflected my own personality and interests. The room that had been her guest room, the room she had kept ready for me for decades, became my home office. The sunroom where we had spent so many mornings reading together became my favorite place to have coffee and plan my days. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I belonged somewhere completely. 6 months after Patricia's death, I received a letter from my adoptive mother. The envelope was addressed in the shaky handwriting I remembered from my childhood, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Eleanor, I have been thinking about our last conversation and the documents you showed us. I realize now that I made mistakes in how I handled your adoption and your place in our family. I would like the opportunity to speak with you about this if you are willing. My health is not good, and I may not have much time left. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive an old woman's poor choices. Love, Mother. I read the letter 3 times, sitting in Patricia's sunroom with morning light streaming through windows that looked out on gardens Patricia had planted with hope and tended with love. The word forgive struck me as particularly significant. Not understand or accept or move past, but forgive, which implied an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that my adoptive family had never been willing to make before. I set the letter aside and thought about what Patricia would want me to do. She had spent her final months encouraging me to be open to love, to give people chances to prove they were worthy of space in my life, to focus on building connections rather than maintaining walls. But she had also made me promise not to waste time trying to earn love from people who weren't capable of giving it. The question was, had my adoptive mother changed, or was this just another manipulation? Another attempt to get me back in line so she could feel better about her choices? There was only one way to find out. I called the number that was still listed for my childhood home, half expecting it to be disconnected or changed. But my mother answered on the fourth ring, her voice weaker than I remembered but still recognizably hers. "Hello. It's Eleanor," I said. "I got your letter." The silence that followed was filled with 91 years of complicated history, 63 years of missed opportunities, and 6 months of painful truth-telling. "Eleanor," she said finally, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. "Your letter. It was different from anything you've ever said to me before. I've had time to think about what you said that night at Margaret's house," she said. "About how we made you feel, about what we did wrong, about the opportunities we missed to love you the way you deserve to be loved." This was already more accountability than I had ever heard from her in my entire life. "And," I prompted, "and I realized that you were right. About all of it. We did exclude you. We did make you feel unwanted. We did treat you differently from our biological children, and we told ourselves it was for reasons that had to do with your personality or your behavior, but the truth was that it was because you weren't really ours." Her honesty was startling and painful and somehow healing all at once. "We were afraid," she continued. "Afraid that if we loved you too much, you would leave us for your birth mother. Afraid that if we treated you exactly like our other children, we would forget that you could be taken away from us at any time. Afraid that if we invested completely in raising you, we would lose you anyway. So instead you made sure I never felt completely loved," I said, understanding the twisted logic of her fear. "That way if I left, it wouldn't hurt as much." "Yes," she whispered. "And instead we hurt you every day for 63 years. We made you feel like you weren't good enough, like you didn't belong. Like there was something wrong with you that made you unworthy of full love and acceptance." I was quiet, processing words I had waited my entire life to hear. "Eleanor," my mother continued, "I know it's too late to change what we did. I know we can't go back and raise you the way we should have. But I need you to know that it wasn't your fault. It was never your fault. You were a beautiful, intelligent, loving child who deserved so much better than what we gave you." "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm dying," she said simply. "And because I realize that I can't face whatever comes next knowing that I left things this way with you. Because you deserve to hear someone from this family acknowledge that we failed you, not the other way around." We talked for another hour, the longest and most honest conversation my adoptive mother and I had ever had. She told me about her own childhood, about her fears around motherhood, about the pressure she had felt to be grateful for any child after years of infertility. She acknowledged that taking those fears out on me had been wrong, that I had spent my life paying for anxieties that had nothing to do with me. "I loved you," she said before we hung up. "I need you to know that. I didn't love you well, and I didn't love you enough, and I didn't love you the way you needed to be loved. But I did love you, Eleanor. You were my daughter too, even if I never figured out how to show it properly." When we ended the call, I felt emotionally drained but also strangely peaceful. The conversation hadn't erased 63 years of pain, but it had provided something I hadn't realized I needed: acknowledgement, accountability, and the understanding that my adoptive family's treatment of me had been about their limitations, not mine. My adoptive mother died 3 weeks later, and this time I was invited to the funeral. I sat in the back of the church, watching as Margaret, David, and Sarah eulogized a woman who had apparently been a wonderful mother to them, a devoted grandmother to their children, and a pillar of their community. None of them mentioned her regrets about how she had raised me, her acknowledgement of the mistakes she had made, or her final attempts to set things right between us. But that was okay. That conversation had been between her and me, and it had given me what I needed: closure, understanding, and the knowledge that in her final weeks, she had finally seen me clearly and had found the courage to tell me the truth. After the funeral, Margaret approached me as I was preparing to leave. "I'm surprised you came," she said, her tone neutral but not hostile. "She called me before she died," I told her. "We talked about things that needed to be discussed." "She mentioned that," Margaret said. "She told me she had apologized to you for how we handled your adoption." I looked at my older sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. She looked older than her 65 years, worn down by years of trying to manage family dynamics and maintain facades that had required enormous energy to sustain. "Did she ever apologize to you?" I asked. "For making you complicit in excluding me all these years? For asking you to go along with treating me like I didn't matter?" Margaret's face showed surprise, as if this perspective had never occurred to her. We never thought of it that way," she said. "You never thought about how it might have felt to systematically exclude someone from family gatherings? You never wondered if it might be harmful to make someone feel unwanted for their entire life?" "We didn't mean to make you feel unwanted," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. "What did you think 40 years of secret family reunions would make me feel?" I asked. "What did you think it would be like for me to discover that my entire family had been celebrating together without me for decades?" Margaret didn't have an answer. "The thing is," I continued, "it doesn't matter anymore. I'm not angry. I'm not hurt. I'm just done. I spent 63 years trying to figure out how to belong in this family, and it turned out I never could because you never intended to let me." I started walking toward my car, then turned back. "I found my real mother," I told her. "Patricia Henderson loved me from the day I was born until the day she died. She spent 6 months showing me what it feels like to be somebody's daughter, what it means to be celebrated instead of tolerated, what family is supposed to feel like." Margaret's face showed something that might have been regret or sadness. "She's dead now," I continued, "but she left me with something you never could, the absolute certainty that I am worthy of love, that my existence matters, that there are people in this world who are better off because I'm in it." I got in my car and drove away from my childhood family for the last time. 2 years later, I was living a life that Patricia would have been proud to see. I had reduced my private investigation caseload to focus on pro bono work, reuniting adoptees with birth families, using my professional skills and personal experience to help other people find the connections they had been missing. I had also started dating, something I hadn't done in the 4 decades since Robert's death. Patricia had been right about my having years ahead of me, and she had been right about my deserving to spend them with someone who thought I was remarkable. His name was Frank, and he was a retired teacher I had met at the library where Patricia used to volunteer. He was kind, intelligent, and had the rare ability to listen to my stories about my complicated family history, without trying to fix anything or offer unwanted advice. He simply accepted that my past had been painful and focused on making sure my present and future were filled with the love and respect I had missed for so many years. "You know what I admire most about you?" he told me one evening as we were cooking dinner together in Patricia's kitchen. "What's that?" "You refused to let other people's inability to love you properly convince you that you were unlovable. You kept believing you were worthy of good things, even when the evidence suggested otherwise." "I didn't always believe that," I admitted. "For a lot of years, I thought there was something fundamentally wrong with me. But you kept trying anyway," he said. "You built a career helping other people. You never gave up hope of finding real family connections, and when you finally found someone who could love you the way you deserved, you were open to receiving it." He was right. Despite everything my adoptive family had put me through, despite decades of feeling like an outsider, despite the pain of discovering how systematically I had been excluded, I had somehow managed to keep my heart open enough to recognize and accept Patricia's love when it was offered. And now I was opening my heart again, this time to a man who saw my strength instead of my neediness, who appreciated my independence instead of being threatened by it, who celebrated my success instead of minimizing it. "Your birth mother would be so proud of how you've built your life," Frank said, putting his arms around me as we stood in the kitchen that had become the heart of my real home. He was right about that too. Patricia would have loved seeing me in a relationship with someone who valued me, living in the house she had kept ready for me, using my professional skills to help other adoptees find their birth families, surrounded by friends who enjoyed my company and respected my contributions to their lives. I had finally learned what my adoptive family had never been able to teach me. That love isn't something you have to earn through perfect behavior or endless accommodation. Love is something you deserve simply because you exist, something that flows naturally between people who recognize each other's worth, something that celebrates rather than merely tolerates the object of its affection. It had taken me 65 years to learn that lesson, but Patricia had been an excellent teacher, and I had been a determined student. Standing in the kitchen of the home my birth mother had kept ready for me, cooking dinner with a man who thought I was worth celebrating, I realized that my adoptive family had given me something valuable after all. They had taught me to recognize genuine love when I finally found it, because I had experienced firsthand what the absence of love felt like. Their cruelty had been unintentional education in what I should never accept again, and their rejection had cleared the path for me to find people who were capable of offering what they never could. Sometimes the greatest gift an inadequate family can give you is the motivation to go out and build a better one. And that's exactly what I had done. The last I heard, Margaret and David were still hosting annual Thompson family reunions, though apparently the celebrations had lost some of their joy since our confrontation 3 years ago. Jennifer had eventually decided to stop attending, choosing instead to build relationships with family members who shared her values about inclusion and respect. Sarah had reached out to me once through a mutual friend, expressing interest in rebuilding our relationship, but when I suggested that we start by having her acknowledge her role in excluding me over the years, she had decided she wasn't ready for that level of honesty. I didn't chase after any of them. I had learned from Patricia that love should never require begging, that family should never feel like an uphill battle, that belonging should never demand the sacrifice of your dignity or self-respect. Instead, I focused on the family I had built. Frank, who loved me completely and consistently, Jennifer and Tyler, who had chosen to maintain their relationship with me despite family pressure, a handful of close friends who had become the siblings I had always wanted, and the memory of Patricia, whose love continued to guide and sustain me even after her death. On the 3rd anniversary of that confrontation at Margaret's house, Frank and I hosted our own family celebration. We invited Jennifer and Tyler, several of my closest friends, and the families I had helped reunite through my adoption work. We hung a banner that read, "Celebrating Love That Chooses Us," and we spent the evening sharing stories about found family, chosen connections, and the beautiful complexity of relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. It was everything a family gathering should be: warm, inclusive, celebratory, and filled with people who were genuinely happy to be there together. As I looked around the table at faces that reflected joy rather than obligation, love rather than tolerance, celebration rather than mere endurance, I thought about how different my life might have been if my adoptive family had been capable of this kind of genuine inclusion. But then I realized that if they had been different people, I might never have developed the strength, independence, and determination that had allowed me to build this chosen family. I might never have become someone who could recognize and appreciate authentic love when it was offered. Their rejection had been painful, but it had also been liberating. It had freed me from the exhausting work of trying to earn acceptance from people who were fundamentally unwilling to give it, and it had taught me to value the rare and precious gift of being loved exactly as I am. That night, as Frank and I were cleaning up after our celebration, he asked me if I ever regretted the way things had ended with my adoptive family. "No," I said without hesitation. "I regret the years I wasted trying to fit into a family that was never going to make room for me. But I don't regret walking away when I finally understood the situation clearly. Even though it meant losing the only family you had known for 63 years? I didn't lose a family," I corrected him. "I stopped pretending that I had one. And that created space for me to find and build real family connections with people who actually wanted me in their lives." He nodded, understanding what I meant. Frank had his own history with family members who had taken him for granted, and he recognized the difference between relationships built on obligation and relationships built on genuine affection. "Besides," I added, "Patricia always said that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. I couldn't go back and have the childhood I deserved, but I could start building the life I deserved from the moment I understood what was possible." And that's exactly what I had done. At 65 years old, I was finally living the life Patricia had hoped I would have, surrounded by people who loved me, respected me, and celebrated my presence in their lives. It had taken me 6 decades to understand that I deserved nothing less, but once I learned that lesson, everything changed. My adoptive family had spent 40 years celebrating traditions that excluded me, never realizing that their cruelty was teaching me exactly what kind of love I should never accept again. Now I was spending my remaining years celebrating traditions that included everyone who wanted to be there, surrounded by people who had chosen to love me, and whom I had chosen to love in return. It was the best possible ending to a story that had started with rejection and abandonment, but had become, through determination and grace, a story about finding home in the most unexpected places. Sometimes you have to lose the family you were born into in order to find the family you were meant to have. And sometimes that loss turns out to be the greatest gift you never knew you needed.